There is a moment when the sun disappears, when darkness falls, and you're left with just your fears. That's the moment you feel your first pang of doubt. That's the moment when the night comes out.
Episode 2, The Witness. People love ghost stories. There's something about an old house, a creaking floor, a creaking door, and shadows which move out of the corner of your eye. There's something both awe-inspiring and terrifying about speaking to the other side. But sometimes, just sometimes, the other side reaches back. In the small town of Knorr, Pennsylvania, the walls between our world and the other side are particularly thin. So, you just know the old house on the hill is going to be hiding more than a few secrets. You're listening to When the Night Comes Out. People talk a lot about things being bad. You hear about people being born bad. There are even those who say objects and things can be bad. I am pretty sure there was a horror movie once about a haunted house that said the house had been born bad. I don't really know if any of that is true or possible, but there are times I wonder about my town. Sometimes I just have to wonder if Knorr, the tiny town in western Pennsylvania that I've resided in my entire life, was born bad. Perhaps that is a bit of a misnomer. I don't think sharks, for example, are bad. They just do what sharks do, and sometimes a swimmer or a surfer gets in the way. I think Knorr is like that. I think things here just get a little thin sometimes. And when reality itself gets thin, sometimes things cross over from the other side and do things on this side of the world. For example, there have been ghost stories connected to Knorr for as long as I can remember. There's a house on Kettle Street that has been rumored to be haunted since I was young. A man who was nicknamed the Boogeyman once killed young girls around Knorr, and I know for a fact that his soul was able to come through to this side and kill some more. That nearly took the life of not only the man who is now my husband, but destroyed the newspaper offices that I had helped build from the ground up. The day that soul punched through nearly tore the town apart. Then there's the story of Jimmy Parker and how he ended up in love with the ghost of a teenaged girl named Sapphire. That nearly tore the town apart too, as he uncovered a long hidden murder that involved some of the most powerful people in town. But Sapphire was so strong, she could not transcend time, but then she and Jimmy together could alter reality itself. You see some crazy stuff if you spend some time in Knorr. My name is Tabitha, by the way. These days my name is Tabitha Hollis, and my husband is Warren Hollis. You might have read some of his true crime work in the past. These days he is making a name for himself in the world of fiction. I have lived in Knorr my entire life, and I have become the witness. I have become the person who sees what goes on here, records it, and then keeps it tucked away. I keep the stories clipped out of newspapers tucked away in boxes. People just come up and tell me their stories of the strange, the paranormal, and the terrifying. And a lot of that happens around here. As I say, it's thin here. Our reality is thin because the wall between dimensions is thin. I may have witnessed what the ghost of the Boogeyman was doing to Warren, and the events that surrounded, which set fire to the newspaper offices, but the real paranormal stuff happened to Warren. I saw Sapphire and what she and Jimmy could do, but the bulk of the truly paranormal happened to Jimmy. I was the witness. I am almost always the witness, which is fine with me. I like being the recorder. However, there's one story that few people know. There's one story I keep to myself where the paranormal happened to me and around me. It's the thing that turned me into the keeper of records of Knorr. It's the story that shaped me. It was the mid-70s, when most of the world was wearing wide collars and men were growing disturbing mustaches, and everyone just seemed hairier and weirder than they do now. I was all of 8 years old, and my mom, who raised me on her own, had just moved into a house not far from downtown Knorr. Of course, then and now, downtown Knorr was little more than a street about 2 blocks long, with some shops, a bakery, a bank, and a diner. There was one stoplight, and people walked around and did their shopping and went to the movies and ate dinner all within those 2 blocks. We had been living in a modular home before that, and then this house had come on the market. My mother had fallen in love with it instantly. It was set high on a hill, although the front of the house faced the opposite direction from the spectacular view. When you were in the backyard, it felt like you could look out into forever. Trees and rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see. It was also down the street from a massive house that has always been known as the house on Kettle Street. It was really 1 block over and down the street. It was a massive wooden structure, grayed from all of the paint being washed away and weathered by time. The house probably looked fantastic when it was first built, with its wide front door, sweet oval windows that looked like cameos decorating the sides, and gingerbread woodwork along the roofline. It was always run down looking with dusty windows and pieces of the siding falling off, and a general sagging and tired look since I was a child. The kids in the neighborhood were afraid of the house. Of course, rumors had come up over the years that it was cursed. It always seemed on the verge of collapsing, perhaps in a storm, but every time the winds blew, every time winter ended, the house was still there. It's like the house itself was defying the elements. I always found it beautiful. While the other kids would run past it, sometimes holding their breath until they were well out of its shadow, I always wanted to stand on the corner and stare up at the windows and marvel at the stately front door. I wanted to run up and peek into the basement windows. And for a long time, throughout that first summer, then into fall and winter, there was nothing at that house for me to see. It was just an old house with dusty windows. The kids I played with squealed and ran past it, and they told each other ghost stories, while the older kids dared each other to go inside and see how long they could stay inside. I remember a spring day when I went for a walk toward my friend Monica's house and was skipping along merrily. The sun was warm and I was in a cute dress, and I was thinking about the games Monica and I would play once I got to her house. I barely even realized I was in the shadow of the house on Kettle Street until it loomed over me and seemed to absorb the sun. Something about the shadow and the house itself just seemed different. I froze there, with the images of Barbies and other games equally frozen in my thoughts. I peered up at the house and, for the first time, felt something akin to fear. I did not feel like running, but the hairs on my arms were standing on end, and I felt chills running up and down my spine. I peered up at the windows that were across the side of the house. The sun was reflecting into my pupils, and I shaded them with my hand. I scanned the windows on the lower level and then the second floor. I gasped. There was a little girl in the window on the second floor. She was very pale, wearing a white dress, her arms by her side. Her eyes were dark, but it was hard to see because of the dust and grime on the window pane. She was staring right at me, no hint of a smile on her face. Her eyes did not blink despite the sun. I smiled. I waved. She just stood there, staring. I waved again, this time so excited that I jumped up and down. Someone was living in the house I loved so much. Someone with a little girl who looked to be about my own age. Maybe they would fix up the place and I could play inside. Funny, I thought. I didn't remember seeing a moving van. But such thoughts do not stick long in an 8-year-old's brain. I waved again. Slowly, as if unsure of how to do it, the little girl in the window slowly raised her right hand, bending her arm at the elbow. Cautiously, she waved back. And then, even more slowly, like trying to watch the tide changing, a smile crept across her pale face, and I swear I saw her eyes light up. "Come on down!" I yelled. I waved again, trying to convey with hand signals that I wished she would come down and play. A sudden look of fear crossed her face. I can remember that clearly. One moment she was smiling, and then the smile faded. The arm fell back to her side. She looked behind, over her shoulder, back into the darkness of the house. She cast another glance at me, and then she was gone, vanishing back into the house. I stood there and waited for some time, hoping she would come back or maybe come out the front door. Instead, the sun got higher in the sky, the day got warmer, and the hairs on my arms went back down. I eventually gave up and ran to Monica's house to tell her the exciting news. Of course, Monica, always the more practical one, told me I was crazy. No one had lived in that house for more than 100 years, she said. She even got her mom to confirm that for me. I felt stupid and got quiet, and I did not have nearly as much fun that afternoon as I had been intending. I finally made up an excuse for why I needed to go back home. Monica protested, but I wanted to go back to the house on Kettle Street and see if my new friend was there. I ran back. My little legs were pumping in that way they only can when you were that young, that naive, and that full of energy. I was not even out of breath when I stopped by the house. By now, the sun was making its descent in the sky. The days were just starting to extend into the later evening, and there was still plenty of sunlight left, but the sky had that look that lets you know it will be sunset soon. I gasped again. This time the little girl was standing on the side of the house, the side that was in the shade. She was just as pale as she had been in the window, but she was there. She was my height, with hair as dark as midnight. She wore a long white dress that looked more than a little out of fashion, and black shoes. I remember thinking it was odd that her lips looked more gray than a healthy pink, but attributed that to her standing in the shadows. She was smiling, and this time she waved first. I waved back and then I ran toward her. She looked stricken at first, but then she smiled again. She was obviously nervous, but then I would have been nervous if I was new to the neighborhood too. "Hi," I said excitedly when I was within the proper distance to talk. "I'm Tabitha. Do you live here?" The smile on the girl's face faltered, and she appeared to struggle to speak. When the words did come out, they were faint, as if she were standing very far away. "My name's Clara," she said. "Yes, I live here with my mom and dad and older brother." I could feel the smile in my face get brighter. "I live just around the corner," I said. "Do you want to play?" Again, her smile faltered for a bit. She looked back at the house, peering up at the windows. Then she stared back at me for a moment, looking me up and down. Then she nodded. These days, I'm not much of a squealer when I do something that excites me, but back then I was. I'm quite sure I let out a loud squeal of delight. I ran to her and took her hand. I remember thinking her skin was very cold, but then Clara and I were running into the backyard. I spent the rest of that afternoon running around the yard, playing hide-and-seek, skipping, and dancing. She was very good at hide-and-seek. I could never find her, but she always found me right away. As the afternoon wore on, she seemed to get a little less pale, and her skin felt a little warmer. Eventually, the sun went down behind the hills. Above us, the stars began to wink at us. We were still running around when I distinctly heard my mother calling me. I froze in mid-step. "Uh-oh," I said. "That's my mom. I have to go." "Must you?" I nodded. "But I'll be back tomorrow." Clara smiled. I smiled. She gave me a hug and then ran off. I waved behind myself as I ran, but I bolted home for dinner. When I got home, my mom looked tired from working in the factory all day, and something inside me told me not to talk to her about my new friend. The way Monica and her mother had reacted told me that this was something that adults would not understand. I ate dinner, watched TV, took a bath, and then went to bed that night without protest. I wanted tomorrow to arrive. That night, though, I could barely sleep. When I did, I dreamed of running in the house with Clara. We were giggling and chasing each other. It was so much fun. Then suddenly, as we ran down one of the house's upstairs hallways, there was a sound from within one of the rooms. Clara stopped running, and a look of pure terror filled her eyes. "Run, Tabitha," she called, and the look of fear pierced me. "Run, we woke him up. He's gonna be so mad." "Who?" Clara did not respond. She just bolted down the hallway. I could hear something thumping on the walls. The floors beneath my feet vibrated. It was as if a great creature had been awakened, and I heard something growl. It was something that was almost, but not quite, human. I heard Clara scream from somewhere in the house. "Clara! Run, Tabitha, run!" The entire house felt like it was coming down around me as the loud thumping filled the air. I turned and ran down the stairs. Near the bottom of the steps, though, I tripped and fell. I went end over end down to the bottom, hitting my head. I lifted my head, but could not move. The sound of the giant footsteps was getting closer. I looked back over my shoulder and I could see a shape moving towards me down the stairs. It was absorbing the light as it went, but I could see red eyes within the shadows, and then flashes of white that I took to be teeth. I screamed and found myself on the floor of my bedroom inside my own house. My mom rushed in, picked me up, held me, and shushed me while telling me it was a nightmare. What she did not seem to notice was the bump on my forehead, however, from where I had hit my head on the floor when I fell in my dream. It is funny how things are when you were a kid. The next morning, the dream was just that, a dream, and I could only remember bits and pieces. I had a bit of a bump on my head, but I had also fallen out of bed, so that didn't bother me. I just ran to Clara's house. Clara was outside, wearing her white dress, on the opposite side from where she had been the day before. She was smiling and appeared nearly as excited as I was the day before. We spent the day playing. I just have images of us hiding, climbing, running, and scampering around outside. I remember a lot of laughing. We barely spoke, but there was no need for words. We were kids, and life was long and good, and the world filled with mystery, and we wanted to explore it all. I remember running through the small wooded patch of land just behind the house, stopping when we reached the edge of the neighbor's yard. "Can we play inside?" I asked as the afternoon wore on. "No," Clara replied. "My dad sleeps during the day, and if we make noise, he gets really mad." A look of pure terror crossed her face. "Where's your mom?" I asked. "She's not here," Clara said, but would say nothing more. "My dad said she left to visit her sister." I thought that was odd, but did not say anything else. We had more playing to do. And so it went for days. The days soon stretched into weeks. I began to get anxious calls from Monica, who wanted to know where I was and why I wasn't coming over. I'm sure I gave excuses, but what they were, I do not recall now. Each day, Clara and I ran and played. We played until the sun went down. I often skipped lunch. Then each night, I would dream of Clara. We played all over the house, but each night something would happen. There would be that noise from inside the house, the growling and anger. Clara would be terrified, and I would run. Then one morning, I walked over to Clara's and found her there, beside the house, but without the smile on her face. She looked sad, and there were streaks down her face as if she had been crying. "We can't play anymore," she said. I felt my heart breaking. "What? Why? What happened?" "My father," she said, whispering, her voice once again faint and sounding far off. He knows that you are coming over here. He wants to keep me inside. He says I cannot go out anymore. He says I'm not allowed to have friends. Oh, Tabitha, he gets so mad. I had not talked about the dreams I'd been having with Clara before. I was desperate. I've had dreams about you and being in the house, I said. Is that your father who wakes up? Clara looked stricken. She raised a hand to the base of her throat as if choking. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper now. I'm sorry, I shouldn't invade your dreams like that, Tabitha. Her eyes appeared to change, becoming sadder and growing dark. You're the only real friend I've ever had, Tabitha. Does he hurt you? I asked. Clara looked over her shoulder at the house, as if expecting her father to appear at any moment. Then she nodded. Come with me, I said, the words just pouring out of my mouth. Come over to my house. We can hide there until my mom gets home. Then we can tell her about your dad. She'll know what to do. This was back when I felt that adults knew everything. It seemed to me that my mom always had the answers to life's questions. She would know what to do. I cannot, Clara cried. Then she turned to run. I ran faster. I caught her arm. It was cold again, like that first day we had met. I grabbed her arm and pulled. She did not resist. Perhaps she had had enough. Perhaps she was just glad to have a friend, but she did not fight. She just ran with me. We ran, and when I entered my front door, slammed it behind me, and then ran into our basement, she was right there with me. That was as far as we had ever run from her house before. She looked beyond terrified, and when we found a place beneath the stairs to hide, she covered her face with her hands and began crying. I put my arms around her and held her as she wept. I don't know how long we were crouching there. I felt terror in my heart and wished that my mother would come home now. It seemed like forever before she would be home. What would we do until then? Oh, Tabitha, Clara said. He's so awful. I think he hurt my mom. I think he hurt her, and that's why she hasn't been around. I could not fully understand what she was trying to tell me. I just told her everything would be all right and to be quiet. Then something happened. It was like a hum. It seemed to seep from the walls, from the ground itself, up through the concrete floors of the basement. It started out low, as if a truck were passing by, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Oh no, Clara cried. He's awake. The fear in my heart turned into a block of ice in my stomach. I looked up at the high basement windows, and it was still mid-afternoon, still hours before my mother would get home. The hum grew louder and louder. I was sure the entire neighborhood could hear it by now. And then the ground began to vibrate, like an earthquake. The sound was everywhere. It was beyond a scream. It was inside my head, and I fell back against the wall. The stomping began. I heard something that sounded like an explosion, close, but also off into the distance a bit. And then the ground shook as something began walking outside, stomping down on the ground, shaking the world. What do we do? I asked. Where do we go? He's never been this mad, Clara said. I've never run away before. He's gonna hurt me, Tabitha. I heard the stomping getting closer and closer. I'm sure my eyes were as wide as saucers. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't run. I just stared into Clara's terrified eyes. Clara was shaking, her eyes dark, her skin almost see-through, it was so pale. The front door of my house burst inward. I heard something hit the far wall.
Where are you?
Clara screamed. I grabbed her and ran for the opposite end of the basement. There was a small room set into the wall. It was just a closet, stockpiled with canned food my mother got from her mother's garden after spending days preparing fruits and vegetables for their hot baths in mason jars. I ran there, flung the door open, and shoved us both inside. I closed the door as I heard feet pounding down the stairs, the basement door having rattled in its frame and banging off the wall.
Clara?
I clasped my hands to my head. The voice was louder than anything I had ever heard. Fists began pounding on the wooden door. It rattled so hard in its frame that splinters flew out of it and across my face.
Come out, Clara.
Clara screamed. I screamed. Something pounded on the door again, and this time a sizable piece of the door flew away. I saw only darkness beyond, shapeless, but shifting like smoke. Then I saw the red eye peer in. Tendrils of smoke sneaked into the hole and unlatched the door. I don't know what came over me, but I suddenly felt the fear vanish. Clara was gibbering beside me, so I stood in front of her protectively. I reached out with one hand, blindly, and grabbed the first thing that came within reach. It turned out to be a wooden rolling pin that my mother had stuck in a box. I held it out in front of me like a talisman. The door flung open, and the black shape was there. I saw teeth. I saw red eyes. The rest of the body appeared human for a moment, and then that would vanish, and then it would become a mass of shadows and smoke, and it poured into the room. "Stay back!" I screamed. Then I swung the rolling pin. I swung at the red eyes that, more or less, remained stable and intact in the middle of the black shape. I aimed right between them. The rolling pin split the eyes apart, and the thing let out a roar that flung me back, over Clara's head, against the far wall. I collided with more boxes and fell. The boxes opened and fell around me. I was dazed. The rolling pin had flown out of my hands. I looked up and the black thing was converging on Clara.
Clara?
"No, Daddy!" Clara screamed. "Don't hurt Tabitha!" To my amazement, Clara stood up at her full height and then seemed to grow bigger. Suddenly, she was a year older than me, and then 10 years. Now she looked like a teenager. As she grew taller, her eyes blazed, having turned from dark pools into white light. The black shape retracted. It acted as if it had been shocked with lightning.
Clara?
The voice said, no longer thundering. "Tabitha is my one and only friend. She's the only friend I've ever had. I'm tired of running from you, tired of being scared," Clara yelled. "And you will not hurt her." Clara shot her hand out and appeared to grab something in the middle of the dark shape. I could feel energy transfer from me into Clara, and suddenly the air got brighter, filled with electricity. The dark shape let out a scream, and the red eyes turned from angry to fearful. The mouth filled with teeth opened. Clara was enveloped in the blackness. The black tendrils beat at her as she held on to something deep inside the darkness. They tore away pieces of her dress, and then the skin beneath. Clara did not let go. Her eyes blazed brighter, and white light began to emanate from the places where the darkness tore through her. I reached out again, and this time came away with something else. Something soft and pliable. I looked down and saw it was an old teddy bear that I had not slept with or used for a long time. I grabbed it and got to my feet. In front of me, Clara had become almost nothing but white light. The white light and dark shadow were entwined. The dark shape was still screaming, but now Clara was screaming as well. I darted forward. I reached out with the teddy bear and shoved it into the darkness. I stuck my hand in there and felt coldness numb my hands and arm, but I shoved it into what I thought was its heart. The thing screamed louder, louder than anything I had ever heard. I held on this time. The white light got brighter and brighter. It encompassed everything, and when I closed my eyes, I could still see it behind my eyelids. The dark shadow began to shrink. The scream became a shriek of rage, anger, and pain. And then it was gone. There was silence. I sat there, arm outstretched, the teddy bear still in my hand, for a long time, When I opened my eyes, I saw spots in front of my eyes. I was alone. For a moment. Then Clara appeared in the middle of the basement. She was no longer pale. She smiled. "Thank you," she said. She ran over to me and kissed me on the cheek. It felt warm. "I have to go," she said. I nodded. I couldn't speak. I felt tears coursing down my cheeks. Clara moved to the middle of the room. She raised her hand in a wave. And then she faded away. The newspaper said that it was a 3.9 rated earthquake that day. No one could explain the shattered windows at the house on Kettle Street, though. No one could explain the footprints that people found in their lawn, the trampled bushes, and the dented sidewalk. My mom was willing to believe that it was the earthquake that caused the damage to our house. However, no earthquake could shatter doors like that, sending splinters across the room to embed in the walls. I kept quiet. Let the grown-ups believe what they wanted. I knew what had happened. Clara was gone. I never saw her again. Of course, that aroused my curiosity. When I could get a library card and figure out how to use the microfilm machine at the library, I did research. I researched the house. It turns out that the house was built by a man named Stilson. He had moved there more than a century ago and built the house. He was well-liked and prominent in town at the time. Knorr was even smaller then, if you can believe it. He had a beautiful wife named Mary Ann, and they gave birth to a gorgeous daughter that they named, you guessed it, Clara. They appeared to have it all until Clara got older. Then Mr. Stilson started acting weird. He started making Clara stay inside. He would not let her play with the other kids. He did not let her go to school, which was much easier to do back then. He became a recluse. Then the house seemed to grow darker and moodier. No one knows for sure why Frank Stilson snapped, but one day, after not showing up for work for a week, some concerned neighbors checked on the Stilson family. What they found was horrifying. They found a house that had been turned into a prison. In the basement, cells had been built and chains were set into the walls. That wasn't the worst of it. They found Mary Ann's body in her bed. She had been hacked to death with an axe. They found Clara in the basement, her little body in the chains. The newspaper accounts did not even want to go into what had been done to her. Police were called and found Frank Stilson hanging from a roof beam in the attic. No one could ever know what happened to him and what made him murder his family and kill himself. The story was quickly pulled from the front pages. Knorr has always been good at forgetting. I knew what had happened. I knew that things in Knorr were different by that point. Something had seeped through the other side and into Frank Stilson's head. Something nasty and evil wriggled in there and drove him mad. That's what happens here in Knorr. Things cross over. As for what happened to Clara, I think she was able to manifest to me finally, perhaps after a century of reaching out, because I needed it. She needed a friend, and I wasn't afraid, and I needed her in a way. I was looking even then for answers. And when her father challenged her, for the first time, she was able to fight back. For the first time, she had love on her side. I did not hear from her again, except for one thing that happened right as I was about to turn 18. I awoke that morning, and on the pillow beside my bed was the teddy bear. I hadn't seen it since that day in the basement, my mother burying it in cardboard boxes. It was battered, old, one eye hanging out. I touched it, and it felt cold. I knew in an instant that it was there from Clara. It was Clara telling me she was okay, and that I would be okay too. I still have that teddy bear in my bedroom, on my dresser, in my home. And now I tell the tales of Knorr. I tell them because I want to, because they deserve to be told. I tell them even if I'm the only one I know will believe it, because Clara deserved to have her vindication and to be set free. I am the witness, and I shall remain so until I become my own ghost story. Knorr is a strange place, and strange things happen all the time. Perhaps you know a place like that. Perhaps your town is like that. Perhaps there's a house just like the one in this tale, just down the street. Who knows what lurks there in the darkness? What comes out when the night comes out? You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, a weekly horror anthology podcast with stories by Brian W. Alaspa and narrated by Allie James. For Brian's work, visit his website at www.brianwalaspa.com or visit amazon.com for his books of fiction and nonfiction, and check out his novels set in the town of Knorr, the Dead Phone, and Sapphire for more of Tabitha and those around there. Be sure to listen to Allie's work on Facebook at Allie James Projects.